There are stories that never make the history books, stories whispered in the dark corners of old towns, passed down from one generation to the next as warnings, as legends, or as secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. This is one of those stories, a tale of brotherhood, betrayal, and a promise sealed in blood that would haunt a family, a town, and perhaps even the land itself for generations. In the summer of 1879, in the quiet farmlands of southern Ohio, the Wilson brothers made a pact that would bind them together in ways no one could have imagined. What began as a desperate act of loyalty would spiral into a nightmare of suspicion, violence, and a mystery that has never been fully solved. Imagine a world where family is everything, where your last name is your only shield against the dangers of the outside world. Now imagine what happens when that shield is shattered from within. The Wilson brothers, Elias, Samuel, and young Thomas, were known throughout Ross County as hard workers, loyal sons, and men of their word. But beneath the surface, something darker was brewing. A secret feud, a hidden crime, and a vow that would demand a price none of them were prepared to pay. What really happened on that sweltering August night? Why did the brothers swear an oath that would change the course of their lives and the fate of everyone around them? Was it justice, revenge, or something far more sinister? The answers lie buried in the red clay of Ohio, in the faded pages of forgotten diaries, and in the memories of those who still whisper the name Wilson with a shiver. Before we unravel the chilling events of that summer, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell. If you crave stories where truth is stranger than fiction, and where the past refuses to stay buried, you won't want to miss what comes next. And as you listen, ask yourself, how far would you go to protect your family? And what would you do if the price was your soul? The Wilson family had always been a fixture in Ross County, Ohio. Their farm, a patchwork of cornfields and pasture land bordered by dense woods, had been carved from the wilderness by their grandfather, a man whose hands were as rough as the stones he pulled from the earth. By 1879, the Wilsons were respected, if not exactly beloved, by their neighbors. They kept to themselves, worked hard, and rarely asked for help. In a world where survival depended on the strength of your kin, the Wilsons were a tribe unto themselves. Elias, the eldest brother, was a man of few words and fewer smiles. At 32, he carried the weight of the family on his broad shoulders. His hair was already streaked with gray, his eyes sharp and watchful. He was the one who rose before dawn to tend the animals, who negotiated with the grain merchants in Chillicothe, and who kept the family's accounts in a battered ledger. Samuel, 2 years younger, was the opposite in many ways, quick to laugh, quick to anger, and always ready with a story or a song. He had a knack for fixing things, from broken plows to wounded animals, and the neighbors often called on him when something needed mending. Then there was Thomas, the youngest, barely 20 and still more boy than man. He idolized his brothers, especially Elias, and would do anything to prove himself worthy of the Wilson name. Their mother, Mary, was a quiet woman whose life had been shaped by loss. She had buried 2 daughters before Thomas was born, and her husband, John, had died in a hunting accident when Thomas was just a child. Since then, Mary had clung to her sons with a fierce, almost desperate love. She kept the house spotless, tended a garden that overflowed with herbs and wildflowers, and prayed every night for the safety of her boys. The summer of 1879 was hotter than anyone could remember. The air hung heavy with the scent of cut hay and distant rain, and the fields shimmered under a relentless sun. The Wilsons worked from dawn to dusk, their shirts soaked with sweat, their hands blistered and raw. The corn grew tall, but the well ran low, and every day brought new worries. There were rumors of sickness in the next county, of cattle dying from some mysterious fever, and of strangers seen lurking near the railroad tracks at night. It was during this uneasy season that the trouble began. It started, as so many tragedies do, with a neighbor's complaint. Old man Haskins, whose farm bordered the Wilsons to the east, accused them of stealing his chickens. He stormed onto their land one morning, waving a shotgun and shouting curses. Elias met him at the fence, his face calm but his eyes cold. "We don't need your chickens, Haskins," he said. "We've got enough mouths to feed as it is." But Haskins wouldn't be swayed. He claimed to have seen Thomas near his coop after dark, and he threatened to bring the sheriff if the birds weren't returned. The accusation stung, not because it was true, but because it was public. In a small town, reputation was everything. The Wilsons could not afford to be seen as thieves. That night, the brothers gathered in the kitchen, their voices low and tense. Thomas swore he hadn't gone near the Haskins place, and Samuel backed him up. Elias listened, his jaw clenched, then made a decision. "We'll settle this ourselves," he said. "No law, no outsiders. We keep it in the family." But the damage was done. Word spread quickly, as it always does in rural places. The Wilsons found themselves shunned at the general store, whispered about at church. Mary's friends stopped calling, and the preacher's visits grew less frequent. The brothers grew more isolated, their tempers shorter, their trust in outsiders all but gone. It was around this time that a stranger appeared in town. He was a tall man, dressed in black, with a face that seemed both familiar and utterly foreign. He asked questions about the Wilsons, about their land, about the old well at the edge of their property. Some said he was a surveyor, others a bounty hunter, still others a relative come to claim a share of the farm. No one knew for sure, and the man offered no answers. He stayed at the boarding house for a week, then vanished as suddenly as he had arrived. The brothers were on edge. Elias took to patrolling the property at night, shotgun in hand. Samuel set traps along the fence line, and Thomas slept with a knife under his pillow. Mary grew pale and thin, her eyes haunted by worry. The farm, once a place of laughter and hard-earned peace, became a fortress besieged by unseen enemies. Then, one night in late August, everything changed. The brothers were awakened by the sound of breaking glass. They rushed downstairs to find the kitchen window shattered, a rock lying on the floor. Attached to it was a note scrawled in a shaky hand. "Thieves get what they deserve. Elias." Read it aloud, his voice steady but his hands trembling. "This ends tonight," he said. The brothers armed themselves and set out into the darkness, determined to catch whoever was tormenting them. They moved silently through the fields, their eyes straining to pierce the shadows. Hours passed, and just as they were about to give up, they heard footsteps near the old well. They crept closer, hearts pounding, and saw a figure bent over the stones, trying to pry loose the cover. Elias called out, and the figure bolted. Samuel gave chase, with Thomas close behind. They caught the intruder at the edge of the woods, a boy no older than Thomas, his face streaked with dirt and fear. He begged for mercy, claiming he was only trying to find water for his sick mother. Elias hesitated, torn between anger and pity, but Samuel, still stinging from the accusations and the isolation, was less forgiving. "You come onto our land, you threaten our family, you pay the price," he spat. What happened next would become the subject of endless speculation and rumor. Some say the brothers beat the boy and sent him on his way. Others claim they dragged him back to the house and locked him in the cellar. Still others whisper that the boy was never seen again, that his ghost haunts the well to this day. The truth, as always, is more complicated and more terrible. The next morning, the Wilsons were changed. Elias was silent, his face drawn and pale. Samuel was jumpy, quick to anger, his hands shaking as he worked. Thomas avoided his brothers, spending long hours alone in the woods. Mary sensed the shift, but when she asked what had happened, the boys offered only silence. That night, as a storm rolled in from the west, the brothers gathered in the barn. The air was thick with the smell of rain and fear. Elias produced a knife, its blade gleaming in the lantern light. "We made a mistake," he said, "but we're brothers. Blood is blood. We take this to our graves." He pricked his finger, letting a drop of blood fall onto the dirt floor. Samuel and Thomas did the same, their faces pale but resolute. They swore an oath, never to speak of what had happened, never to betray each other, no matter the cost. The storm raged outside, thunder shaking the walls, lightning illuminating the fields. Inside the barn, the Wilson brothers sealed their pact. bound together by blood and by a secret that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The days after the blood oath passed in a haze of tension and unspoken dread. The Wilson farm, once alive with the sounds of work and laughter, now felt heavy and watchful, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The brothers went about their chores with mechanical precision, barely speaking except when necessary. Mary, sensing the change but unable to name it, grew more withdrawn, her prayers longer and more desperate each night. Rumors about the Wilsons multiplied in the town. Old man Haskins, emboldened by the recent trouble, told anyone who would listen that the Wilson boys were up to no good. He claimed to have seen strange lights in their fields at night, to have heard screams carried on the wind. Others whispered that the Wilsons were cursed, that their land was tainted by some old sin. The story of the missing boy, never reported, never confirmed, became a ghost story told to frighten children. Stay away from the Wilson place, parents warned. There are things there that don't want to be found. The brothers tried to ignore the gossip, but it seeped into their bones. Elias became more reclusive, spending hours in the fields or locked in the barn, his thoughts a storm of guilt and fear. Samuel's temper grew shorter, and he began drinking in secret, seeking solace in the bottom of a bottle. Thomas, once eager and bright, now wandered the woods alone, haunted by nightmares he could not escape. The oath they had sworn bound them together, but it also isolated them, cutting them off from the world and from each other. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned the color of bruised fruit, Mary found Thomas sitting by the well, his face pale and drawn. She sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Mary broke the silence. "Whatever it is, you can tell me," she said softly. Thomas shook his head, tears glistening in his eyes. "I can't, Mama. I promised." Mary reached out, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "Some promises aren't meant to be kept," she whispered. But Thomas only looked away, his gaze fixed on the dark water below. That night, the dreams returned. Thomas saw the boy from the woods, his face twisted in fear, his hands reaching out for help. He heard the sound of the oath, the words echoing in his mind like a curse. He woke in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, the taste of blood in his mouth. He stumbled to the window, looking out over the fields, and saw a figure standing by the well. For a moment he thought it was the boy, come back to haunt him. But as the figure turned, Thomas realized with a jolt that it was Elias, his face pale and haunted in the moonlight. The next morning, Thomas confronted his brother. "You saw him too, didn't you?" he asked. Elias hesitated, then nodded. "We did a terrible thing, Tom, but we can't change it now. We have to live with it." Thomas shook his head, his voice trembling. "I don't think we can. I think it's going to kill us." Elias put a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. "We're Wilsons. We survive. That's what we do." But survival came at a cost. The farm's fortunes began to decline. The corn withered in the fields. The cows grew sickly and thin. Tools broke, fences fell, and the well, once the heart of the farm, began to run dry. Mary's health faltered, her face growing gaunt, her eyes ringed with shadows. The brothers worked harder, but nothing seemed to help. It was as if the land itself was punishing them, refusing to yield to their efforts. The town took notice. The preacher visited, offering prayers and platitudes, but his words rang hollow. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles and awkward smiles, but their eyes were wary, their visits brief. The Wilsons were alone, surrounded by suspicion and fear. The only solace came in the rare moments when the brothers remembered their childhood, fishing in the creek, racing through the fields, listening to their father's stories by the fire. But those memories felt distant, like echoes from another life. One afternoon, as a storm gathered on the horizon, Samuel returned from town with news. "Haskins is stirring up trouble," he said, his voice tight. "He's telling folks we're hiding something. Says he's going to bring the sheriff." Elias's jaw tightened. "Let him come. We've got nothing to hide." But Thomas flinched at the words, his guilt gnawing at him like a rat in the walls. That night, the storm broke. Lightning split the sky, thunder rattled the windows. The brothers huddled in the kitchen, the air thick with fear. Suddenly, there was a pounding at the door. Elias grabbed the shotgun, Samuel a lantern, and Thomas a knife. They opened the door, to find Haskins and 2 other men, their faces grim and determined. "We're here for the truth," Haskins said. "You can tell us, or you can tell the law." Elias stood his ground, his voice cold. "There's nothing to tell. Go home." But Haskins pushed past him, the other men following. They searched the house, the barn, the fields. When they reached the well, Haskins peered into the darkness, his face pale in the lantern light. "What's down there?" he demanded. Elias's voice was steady. "Just water, same as always." But Thomas's hands shook, and Samuel's eyes darted nervously. The men found nothing, but the damage was done. The next day, the sheriff arrived, asking questions the brothers could not answer. The town's suspicion turned to open hostility. The Wilsons were shunned, their farm boycotted, their names spoken only in whispers. Mary grew weaker, her spirit broken by the weight of secrets and lies. Desperate, the brothers turned on each other. Samuel accused Elias of being too proud, too stubborn to ask for help. Elias blamed Thomas for being weak, for letting his guilt show. Thomas, caught between them, felt himself unraveling. The oath that had once bound them now threatened to destroy them. One night, unable to sleep, Thomas wandered into the woods. He followed a path he had known since childhood, his feet moving of their own accord. He found himself at the old well, the air thick with the scent of rain and earth. He knelt by the stones, his hands trembling. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." For a moment, the world was silent. Then, from the darkness below, he heard a voice, a whisper, barely more than a breath. "Blood is blood. A debt must be paid." Thomas stumbled back, his heart pounding. He ran home, but the words followed him, echoing in his mind. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the oath was not finished, that someone, was waiting for them to pay the price. The next morning, Thomas tried to tell his brothers what he had heard, but they dismissed it as a dream. "You're just tired," Samuel said. "We all are." But Elias's eyes were troubled, and he watched Thomas with a new wariness. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. The farm slipped further into ruin, and Mary's health declined. The brothers clung to their oath, but it offered no comfort, only a reminder of the secret that bound them together, and the darkness that threatened to tear them apart. As autumn deepened, the Wilsons faced a choice. They could confess, risk everything in the hope of forgiveness. Or they could hold fast to their oath, trusting that blood would protect them. In the end, they chose silence. The price of their secret would be paid, one way or another. The first frost came early that year, painting the fields in silver and turning the Wilson farm into a landscape of brittle beauty. But beneath the shimmering surface, rot had set in. The corn that had survived the summer's heat now withered. In the cold, and the cattle grew thin, their ribs showing through patchy hides. The Wilson brothers worked harder than ever, but it was as if the land itself had turned against them, refusing to yield to their sweat and toil. Mary's decline was the most painful to witness. Once the heart of the family, she now spent her days in bed, her breath shallow, her eyes distant. She spoke little, and when she did, her words were often confused, drifting between the present and the past. Sometimes she called for her husband, sometimes for the daughters she had lost. But most often she called for her sons, her voice trembling with fear. "Promise me," she would whisper, clutching their hands with surprising strength. "Promise me you'll stay together. Promise me you'll keep each other safe." The brothers always nodded, but the promise felt hollow, a lie told to comfort a dying woman. The town's suspicion grew with each passing week. The sheriff returned, this time with a deputy and a warrant to search the property. The brothers watched in silence as the men combed through the house, the barn, the fields. They pried up floorboards, dug in the garden, even lowered a lantern into the well. But they found nothing, no evidence, No body, no proof of wrongdoing. The sheriff left with a warning. If you're hiding something, it will come out. Secrets don't stay buried forever. The brothers tried to carry on, but the pressure was relentless. Samuel's drinking worsened, and he began to disappear for days at a time, returning with wild eyes and trembling hands. Elias grew more withdrawn, his face gaunt, his eyes haunted. He spent long hours in the barn, carving strange symbols into the beams, muttering to himself. Thomas, caught between his brothers, felt himself unraveling. He dreamed of the boy from the woods, of blood on his hands, of voices whispering in the darkness. One night, unable to sleep, Thomas wandered outside. The moon was full, casting long shadows across the fields. He found himself drawn to the well, the place where everything had changed. He knelt by the stones, his breath clouding in the cold air. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." For a moment, the world was silent. Then, from the darkness below, he heard a sound, a faint rhythmic tapping, like the beating of a heart. Terrified, Thomas stumbled back, tripping over a root and falling hard to the ground. He lay there, staring up at the sky, his mind racing. Was it his imagination, or was something truly haunting the well? He thought of the oath, of the blood they had spilled, and wondered if it was enough to bind the secret, or if it had only made things worse. The next morning, Thomas tried to tell Elias what he had heard, but his brother dismissed it as a dream. "You're tired, Tom. We all are. Just try to get some rest." But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming for them, something they couldn't escape. As winter set in, the farm's fortunes reached their lowest point. The last of the cattle died, and the corn in the silo turned to mold. The brothers sold what little they had left to pay for Mary's medicine, but it was never enough. The townspeople avoided them, crossing the street rather than meet their eyes. The preacher stopped coming altogether, and the mailmen left their letters at the edge of the property. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, the brothers sat in the kitchen, the only light coming from a single, sputtering candle. Mary slept fitfully in the next room, her breathing ragged. Samuel stared into his cup, his hands shaking. "We can't go on like this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something's got to give." Elias looked at him, his eyes hollow. "We made a promise. We stick to it." Thomas, unable to bear the tension, stood and left the room. He wandered through the house, the wind howling outside, the walls creaking with the weight of the storm. He found himself in the cellar, the air damp and cold. He remembered the night of the oath, the feel of the knife in his hand, the taste of blood on his tongue. He knelt on the dirt floor, his hands shaking. "Please," he whispered, "let us be free." Suddenly the candle in his hand flickered and went out, plunging him into darkness. He heard a voice, a whisper, barely more than a breath. "A debt must be paid." Thomas scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding. He ran upstairs, slamming the door behind him. The next morning, the storm had passed, but the world felt changed. The snow lay thick on the ground, muffling every sound. The brothers went about their chores in silence, each lost in his own thoughts. That afternoon, a group of townspeople arrived, led by Old Man Haskins. They demanded answers, their faces hard and unforgiving. "We know you're hiding something," Haskins said. "It's time to come clean." Elias stood his ground, his voice steady. "We've got nothing to say to you." But the townspeople wouldn't be swayed. They searched the property again, this time more thoroughly. They found nothing, but the suspicion remained. That night, Mary took a turn for the worse. The brothers gathered by her bedside, their faces drawn and pale. She looked at each of them in turn, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Promise me," she whispered, "that you'll tell the truth. Promise me you'll let go of the past." The brothers nodded, tears streaming down their faces. But in their hearts, they knew the promise was one they could not keep. Mary died before dawn, her passing as quiet as her life had been. The brothers buried her in the family plot, the ground frozen and unyielding. The townspeople attended the funeral, their faces solemn, their eyes wary. The preacher spoke of forgiveness and redemption, but his words rang hollow. After the funeral, the brothers returned to the house, the silence between them heavier than ever. Samuel broke first, his voice raw with grief. "We can't keep doing this, Eli. It's killing us." Elias stared at him, his face hard. "We made a promise. We stick to it." Thomas, unable to bear the tension, left the room. He wandered through the fields, the snow crunching beneath his boots. He found himself at the well, the place where it had all begun. He knelt by the stones, his breath clouding in the cold air. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." For a moment, the world was silent. Then from the darkness below he heard a sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like the beating of a heart. Terrified, Thomas stumbled back, tripping over a root and falling hard to the ground. He lay there, staring up at the sky, his mind racing. Was it his imagination, or was something truly haunting the well? He thought of the oath, of the blood they had spilled, and wondered if it was enough to bind the secret, or if it had only made things worse. The days that followed were a blur, of grief and exhaustion. The brothers went through the motions of daily life, but their hearts weren't in it. The farm continued to decline, and the townspeople's suspicion grew. The sheriff returned, this time with a deputy and a warrant to search the property. The brothers watched in silence as the men combed through the house, the barn, the fields. They pried up floorboards, dug in the garden, even lowered a lantern into the well. But they found nothing, no evidence, no body, no proof of wrongdoing. The sheriff left with a warning. "If you're hiding something, it will come out. Secrets don't stay buried forever." The brothers tried to carry on, but the pressure was relentless. Samuel's drinking worsened, and he began to disappear for days at a time, returning with wild eyes and trembling hands. Elias grew more withdrawn, his face gaunt, his eyes haunted. He spent long hours in the barn, carving strange symbols into the beams, muttering to himself. Thomas, caught between his brothers, felt himself unraveling. He dreamed of the boy from the woods, of blood on his hands, of voices whispering in the darkness. One night, unable to sleep, Thomas wandered outside. The moon was full, casting long shadows across the fields. He found himself drawn to the well, the place where everything had changed. He knelt by the stones, his breath clouding in the cold air. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." For a moment, the world was silent. Then, from the darkness below, he heard a sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping like the beating of a heart. Terrified, Thomas stumbled back, tripping over a root and falling hard to the ground. He lay there, staring up at the sky, his mind racing. Was it his imagination, or was something truly haunting the well? He thought of the oath, of the blood they had spilled, and wondered if it was enough to bind the secret, or if it had only made things worse. The next morning, Thomas tried to tell Elias what he had heard, but his brother dismissed it as a dream. "You're tired, Tom. We all are. Just try to get some rest." But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming for them, something they couldn't escape. As winter set in, the farm's fortunes reached their lowest point. The last of the cattle died, and the corn in the silo turned to mold. The brothers sold what little they had left to pay for Mary's medicine, but it was never enough. The townspeople avoided them, crossing the street rather than meet their eyes. The preacher stopped coming altogether, and the mailman left their letters at the edge of the property. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, the brothers sat in the kitchen, the only light coming from a single sputtering candle. Mary slept fitfully in the next room, her breathing ragged. Samuel stared into his cup, his hands shaking. "We can't go on like this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something's got to give." Elias looked at him, his eyes hollow. "We made a promise. We stick to it." Thomas, unable to bear the tension, stood and left the room. He wandered through the house, the wind howling outside, the walls creaking with the weight of the storm. He found himself in the cellar, the air damp and cold. He remembered the night of the oath, the feel of the knife in his hand, the taste of blood on his tongue. He knelt on the dirt floor, his hands shaking. "Please," he whispered, "let us be free." Suddenly the candle in his hand flickered and went out, plunging him into darkness. He heard a voice, a whisper, barely more than a breath. A debt must be paid. Thomas scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding. He ran upstairs, slamming the door behind him. The next morning the storm had passed, but the world felt changed. The snow lay thick on the ground, muffling every sound. The brothers went about their chores in silence, each lost in his own thoughts. That afternoon, a group of townspeople arrived, led by Old Man Haskins. They demanded answers, their faces hard and unforgiving. "We know you're hiding something," Haskins said. "It's time to come clean." Elias stood his ground, his voice steady. "We've got nothing to say to you." But the townspeople wouldn't be swayed. They searched the property again, this time more thoroughly. They found nothing, but the suspicion remained. That night, Mary took a turn for the worse. The brothers gathered by her bedside, their faces drawn and pale. She looked at each of them in turn, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Promise me," she whispered, "that you'll tell the truth. Promise me you'll let go of the past." The brothers nodded, tears streaming down their faces, but in their hearts, they knew the promise was one they could not keep. Mary died before dawn, her passing as quiet as her life had been. The brothers buried her in the family plot, the ground frozen and unyielding. The townspeople attended the funeral, their faces solemn, their eyes wary. The preacher spoke of forgiveness and redemption, but his words rang hollow. After the funeral, the brothers returned to the house, the silence between them heavier than ever. Samuel broke first, his voice raw with grief. "We can't keep doing this, Eli. It's killing us." Elias stared at him, his face hard. "We made a promise. We stick to it." Thomas, unable to bear the tension, left the room. He wandered through the fields, the snow crunching beneath his boots. He found himself at the well, the place where it had all begun. He knelt by the stones, his breath clouding in the cold air. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." For a moment, the world was silent. Then, from the darkness below, he heard a sound, a faint rhythmic tapping, like the beating of a heart. Terrified, Thomas stumbled back, tripping over a root and falling hard to the ground. He lay there, staring up at the sky, his mind racing. Was it his imagination, or was something truly haunting the well? He thought of the oath, of the blood they had spilled, and wondered if it was enough to bind the secret, or if it had only made things worse. Winter deepened, and the Wilson farm became a place of ghosts. The snow never seemed to melt, piling up against the doors and windows, muffling every sound. The brothers moved through the house like shadows, barely speaking, their faces gaunt and hollow-eyed. The only sign of life was the fire in the hearth, which Elias kept burning day and night, as if afraid of what might creep in with the cold. Samuel's drinking grew worse. He would disappear for hours, sometimes days, returning with wild stories and a haunted look in his eyes. He claimed to see the boy from the woods everywhere, in the barn, by the well, even in his dreams. "He's watching us, Eli," Samuel whispered one night, his voice shaking. "He wants us to pay." Elias tried to comfort him, but his own nerves were frayed. He too had seen things he couldn't explain. Footprints in the snow that led nowhere. Strange symbols carved into the trees. The feeling of being watched whenever he ventured outside. Thomas fared no better. He spent his days wandering the woods, searching for some sign of forgiveness, some way to undo what they had done. He spoke to the trees, to the wind, to the frozen earth, but received no answer. At night he dreamed of blood and water, of hands reaching up from the well, of voices whispering his name. He grew thin and pale, his eyes ringed with shadows. The farm itself seemed to suffer along with them. The roof leaked, the fences fell, and the last of the food stores dwindled. The brothers were forced to hunt for their meals, but even the woods seemed empty, as if the animals had fled from the curse that hung over the land. The townspeople, sensing the Wilsons' desperation, grew bolder in their hostility. They left dead animals at the edge of the property, scrawled threats on the barn door, and spread rumors that the brothers were practicing witchcraft. One night, as a blizzard raged outside, the brothers sat in the kitchen, the only light coming from the fire. Samuel was drunk, his words slurred and angry. "We should have told the truth," he spat. "We should have gone to the law." Elias shook his head, his voice cold. "It's too late for that now. We made a promise." Thomas stared into the flames, his mind racing. "Maybe it's not too late," he whispered. "Maybe if we confess, things will get better." Samuel laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You think they'll forgive us? You think they'll just let us go?" Elias slammed his fist on the table, the sound echoing through the empty house. "Enough. We stick to the oath. We survive. That's what Wilsons do." The argument ended in silence, the fire crackling in the hearth. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, listening to the wind howl outside, the house creaking with the weight of the snow. He thought of his mother, of the promise he had made at her bedside, of the blood oath he had sworn with his brothers. He wondered if there was any way out, any path to redemption. As dawn approached, he made a decision. He rose quietly, dressing in the cold darkness. He slipped outside, the snow crunching beneath his boots. He made his way to the well, the place where it had all begun. He knelt by the stones, his breath clouding in the air. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I want to make it right." For a moment, the world was silent. Then, from the darkness below, he heard a voice, a whisper, barely more than a breath. A debt must be paid. Thomas returned to the house, his mind made up. He woke his brothers, his voice steady. "We have to tell the truth. It's the only way." Elias shook his head, his face hard. "No, we survive. That's what we do." Samuel looked at Thomas, his eyes filled with fear. "What if it's not enough? What if the truth won't save us?" Thomas stood his ground. "I can't live like this anymore. I'm going to the sheriff." Elias tried to stop him, but Thomas was determined. He pulled on his coat and boots, bracing himself against the cold. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I have to do this." He made his way through the snow, the wind biting at his face. The town was quiet, the streets empty. He found the sheriff at the jail, warming himself by the stove. Thomas told him everything: the boy in the woods, the blood oath, the voices in the night. The sheriff listened in silence, his face unreadable. When Thomas finished, the sheriff nodded. "Thank you for telling me. I'll take it from here." The sheriff gathered a posse and rode out to the Wilson farm. Elias and Samuel were waiting, their faces pale and drawn. The sheriff questioned them, but they stuck to their story. "We don't know anything," Elias said. "Thomas is confused. He's been sick." The sheriff searched the property again, but found nothing. The well was frozen solid, the barn empty, the house cold and silent. The sheriff left, taking Thomas with him. The townspeople watched as the brothers were separated, their faces a mix of curiosity and fear. Rumors spread quickly. Some said Thomas had gone mad, others that he had confessed to murder. The truth, as always, was more complicated. In the days that followed, the Wilson farm fell into ruin. Elias and Samuel tried to carry on, but the weight of their secret was too much to bear. Samuel's drinking worsened, and one night he disappeared into the woods, never to be seen again. Elias grew more withdrawn, spending his days in the barn, carving strange symbols into the beams, muttering to himself. The townspeople avoided the farm, convinced it was cursed. Thomas, meanwhile, languished in the jail, his mind unraveling. He spoke of voices in the night, of hands reaching up from the well, of a debt that could never be paid. The sheriff tried to help him, but there was nothing to be done. Thomas died in his cell, his last words a whisper: "Blood is blood. A debt must be paid." The news of Thomas's death spread quickly. The townspeople shook their heads, muttering about curses and madness. The sheriff returned to the Wilson farm one last time, hoping to find answers. He found Elias in the barn, his body cold and still, a knife in his hand. On the wall above him, carved deep into the wood, were the words, "We kept the oath. The Wilson farm was abandoned, left to rot in the snow." The townspeople avoided it, telling stories of ghosts and curses, of voices in the night and debts unpaid. The well, once the heart of the farm, was filled in, the stones scattered. But some say that on cold winter nights, when the wind howls and the snow falls thick, you can still hear the sound of voices, whispers carried on the wind, repeating the words of the oath. Blood is blood. A debt must be paid. The story of the Wilson brothers became a legend, a warning to those who would let secrets fester and promises go unbroken. The farm was eventually reclaimed by the woods, the fields swallowed by trees and undergrowth. But the memory of what happened there lingered, a shadow on the land, a reminder that some debts can never be paid, and some oaths are better left unspoken. Years passed, and the Wilson farm faded from memory, its fields overtaken by wild grass and saplings, the house collapsing in on itself, the barn a skeleton against the sky. Yet the story of the Wilson brothers refused to die. Children dared each other to approach the ruins, swearing they heard voices in the wind or saw pale faces at the broken windows. Hunters avoided the woods nearby, claiming their dogs would whimper and refuse to go near the old well, even though it had long since been filled and forgotten. The town of Ross County changed with the times. The railroad brought new families, new businesses, and new scandals. But the legend of the Wilsons remained, a dark thread woven through the fabric of local lore. Every so often, a stranger would arrive, asking questions about the brothers, the missing boy, or the blood oath. The answers were always the same. That was a long time ago, best to let the past rest. But the past did not rest. In the spring of 1897, nearly 2 decades after the last Wilson brother died, a group of boys exploring the woods stumbled upon something strange. The heavy rains had washed away part of the earth near the old well, exposing a bundle of rotted cloth and brittle bones. The sheriff was called, and the remains were quietly collected and buried in the town cemetery, marked only as unknown. The discovery reignited old rumors. Some whispered that the bones belonged to the boy from the woods, others that they were the remains of one of the Wilsons themselves, never truly at peace. The renewed gossip brought a new wave of curiosity. Seekers, reporters from Columbus and Cincinnati arrived, hoping to uncover the truth behind the Wilson legend. They interviewed the oldest residents, pored over faded court records, and even tried to dig up the well again, but found nothing more than mud and stones. The story, they concluded, was just that, a story. But the people of Ross County knew better. They had lived with the shadow of the Wilsons for too long to dismiss it so easily. Some families claimed to have letters or diaries from that time, passed down through generations. One such diary, written by a neighbor girl named Lila, described the night of the storm when the boy disappeared. She wrote of seeing lanterns moving through the fields, of hearing shouts and cries, and of her father returning home pale and silent, refusing to speak of what he had seen. Another letter, penned by the town's preacher, spoke of visiting Mary Wilson on her deathbed, of her desperate pleas for her sons to let go of the past, and of the terrible weight she carried to her grave. The legend grew with each retelling. Some said the Wilsons had been cursed by the boy's family, others that the land itself was tainted by the blood oath. A few insisted that the brothers had been innocent, victims of a town's fear and suspicion. But most agreed on one thing: the Wilsons had paid a terrible price for their silence, and the debt had never truly been settled. As the 20th century dawned, the ruins of the Wilson farm became a place of pilgrimage for those drawn to the macabre. Ghost hunters set up camp in the woods, hoping to record the whispers said to echo from the well. Folklorists collected stories from the oldest residents, piecing together a patchwork of fact and fiction. Some claimed to have seen the brothers' ghosts wandering the fields on moonless nights, their faces pale and sorrowful. Others spoke of strange lights in the woods, of cold spots near the well, and of dreams filled with blood and water. The story even made its way into local school books, a cautionary tale about the dangers of secrets and the power of family bonds. Teachers would tell their students, "Remember the Wilsons. Some promises are too heavy to bear alone." The lesson was clear. The past cannot be buried, no matter how deep the well. But for all the stories, the truth remained elusive. The sheriff's records from 1879 were incomplete, the court documents missing or destroyed. The only evidence that remained were the bones found by the well, the carvings in the barn, and the memories of those who had lived through that terrible winter. The rest was lost to time, swallowed by the woods and the silence of the land. In the end, the Wilson brothers became more than just a story. They became a symbol. For some, they represented the dangers of pride and secrecy, the way a single mistake can spiral into tragedy. For others, they were a reminder of the strength of family, of the bonds that can both protect and destroy. And for a few, they were simply a mystery, a puzzle with no solution, a question that would never be answered. Yet, the land remembered. On certain nights, when the wind was just right and the moon hung low over the fields, the people of Ross County claimed you could still hear the echoes of the past, the sound of three brothers swearing an oath, the whisper of a promise made in blood, and the mournful cry of a debt that could never be paid. The Wilson farm is gone now, reclaimed by the forest and the passage of time, but the story endures, passed from parent to child, neighbor to neighbor, stranger to stranger. It is a story of love and loss, of guilt and redemption, of the terrible price of silence. And as long as the wind blows through the trees and the well lies hidden beneath the earth, the legend of the Wilson brothers will live on. By the early 1900s, the Wilson farm was little more than a memory, a patch of tangled woods and sunken earth on the edge of Ross County. Yet the story of the blood oath refused to fade. It was as if the land itself held on to the secret, waiting for someone to listen. And in 1912, someone did. Her name was Clara Jennings, a young school teacher from Chillicothe, with a fascination for local history and a stubborn streak that matched any Wilson. Clara had heard the stories as a child. Her grandmother had been a friend of Mary Wilson, and her uncle claimed to have seen the ghostly lanterns in the fields. Now, as an adult, Clara was determined to separate fact from legend. She began by interviewing the oldest residents, recording their memories in a leather-bound notebook. She visited the county courthouse, searching for records, and spent long afternoons in the library, poring over old newspapers and letters. What Clara found was a tangle of contradictions. Some remembered the Wilson brothers as hardworking and loyal, others as secretive and dangerous. The story of the missing boy was especially elusive. No one could remember his name, or even where he had come from. Some said he was a runaway, others a neighbor's son, still others a figment of frightened imaginations. The only thing everyone agreed on was that after that summer, nothing was ever the same. Clara's research led her to the ruins of the Wilson farm. She visited on a bright spring morning, the air thick with the scent of wildflowers and new grass. The house was gone, the barn collapsed, but the well remained, a circle of mossy stones half buried in the earth. Clara knelt by the well, running her fingers over the rough surface. She felt a chill, as if the ground itself was holding its breath. She spent hours exploring the site, taking notes and photographs. She found the remains of a fence, a rusted horseshoe, and, in the barn's ruins, a beam carved with strange symbols. She copied the carvings into her notebook, determined to find their meaning. As the sun began to set, Clara sat by the well, listening to the wind in the trees. She thought of the brothers, of the oath they had sworn, and wondered what it must have felt like to carry such a secret. That night, Clara dreamed of the Wilsons. She saw three brothers standing in a circle, their hands joined, their faces solemn. She heard the words of the oath, felt the weight of the promise. She woke with a start, her heart pounding, the memory of the dream lingering like a shadow. Clara returned to the farm again and again, each visit revealing something new. She found a fragment of blue china in the garden, a child's shoe near the well, a rusted knife in the barn. She spoke to more neighbors, piecing together the story bit by bit. Some were eager to talk, others wary. A few warned her to leave the past alone. Some things are better forgotten, an old woman told her, her eyes clouded with memory. The Wilsons paid their price. Don't go digging up old ghosts. But Clara couldn't let it go. The more she learned, the more she felt the story pulling her in. She began to dream of the brothers every night, their faces growing clearer, their voices more insistent. She saw the boy from the woods, his eyes wide with fear, his hands reaching out for help. She heard the words of the oath, the promise made, in blood. She woke each morning exhausted, her mind filled with questions. One afternoon, Clara visited the county archives, hoping to find a clue in the old court records. She found a single page, yellowed with age, tucked between two property deeds. It was a statement from the sheriff, dated December 1879. No evidence found at the Wilson farm. Brothers maintain their innocence. Town remains uneasy. Recommend further investigation. There was a note in the margin, written in a different hand. Ask about the well. The next day, Clara returned to the farm, determined to find answers. She brought a lantern and a length of rope, planning to lower herself into the well. The air was cool and damp, the stones slick with moss. She tied the rope to a tree and climbed down, her heart pounding. The well was deeper than she expected, the darkness pressing in on all sides. At the bottom, she found nothing but mud and stones. But as she turned to climb back up, her lantern flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. For a moment, Clara thought she saw something, a shape moving in the darkness, a hand reaching out. She scrambled up the rope, her breath coming in gasps. When she reached the surface, she collapsed on the grass, her hands shaking. She told herself it was just her imagination, the power of the story getting to her. But deep down, she knew there was something more. Clara's visits to the farm became less frequent after that. She finished her research, writing a long article for the local paper. She told the story of the Wilson brothers, the blood oath, and the missing boy. She included the memories of the townspeople, the diary entries, the sheriff's report. She ended with a warning. The past is never truly buried. The land remembers, and some debts can never be paid. The article caused a stir in Ross County. Some praised Clara for her thoroughness, others accused her of stirring up old wounds. A few claimed to have seen the brothers' ghosts after the story was published, wandering the fields on moonless nights. The legend of the Wilsons grew stronger, fueled by Clara's words and the power of memory. But for Clara, the story was never truly finished. She continued to dream of the brothers, to feel the weight of their secret. She wondered if the oath had been broken, or if it still bound the land in silence. She wondered if the debt had been paid, or if it lingered, waiting for someone else to bear its burden. In time, Clara moved away from Ross County, but the story followed her. She received letters from strangers, asking about the Wilsons, the well, the blood oath. She answered as best she could, but the truth remained elusive. The past, she realized, is never truly gone. It waits in the shadows, in the stories we tell, in the secrets we keep. And so the legend of the Wilson brothers endures, a story of love and loss, of guilt and redemption, of the terrible price of silence. It is a story that belongs to the land, to the people of Ross County, and to anyone who has ever made a promise they could not keep. Decades slipped by, and the world outside Ross County changed in ways the Wilson brothers could never have imagined. Automobiles rumbled down roads that once saw only horses and wagons. Electric lights replaced lanterns, and the old stories faded into the background noise of modern life. Yet, in the quiet corners of the county, the legend of the Wilsons endured. It was told in whispers at sleepovers, recounted by old men on porches, and written in the margins of local history books. The blood oath, the missing boy, the haunted well, these were not just tales, but warnings, reminders of the darkness that can take root in even the most ordinary places. In 1937, a drought struck southern Ohio, the worst in living memory. Wells dried up, crops failed, and tempers flared. The land around the old Wilson farm, long abandoned and overgrown, was cleared by a desperate farmer hoping to find new ground for planting. As the bulldozers tore through the brush, they uncovered the crumbling foundation of the Wilson house, and beside it, the stones of the old well. The discovery made the local paper, and for a few weeks the legend was revived. People came to see the site, to take photographs, to tell stories of the brothers and their oath. Among the visitors was a young man named Henry Wilson, a distant relative who had grown up hearing the family legend. Henry was a student at Ohio State, studying history, and he saw in the ruins an opportunity to finally lay the story to rest. He spent the summer interviewing locals, collecting artifacts and piecing together the fragments of the past. He found Clara Jennings' article, the sheriff's report, and even a scrap of the diary written by Lila, the neighbor girl. The more he learned, the more he realized how much had been lost to time, and how much still lingered in the shadows. One evening, as the sun set over the fields, Henry sat by the well, reading through his notes. He felt a strange sense of connection to the brothers, as if their story was not just history, but a part of him. He wondered what it must have been like to carry such a secret, to live with the weight of a promise made in blood. He thought of the missing boy, of Mary Wilson's dying plea, of the voices said to echo from the well on cold winter nights. As darkness fell, Henry heard a sound, a faint rhythmic tapping, like the beating of a heart. He looked down into the well, half expecting to see a face staring back at him. But there was only darkness, deep and impenetrable. He shivered, closed his notebook, and walked back to his car, the legend of the Wilson brothers heavy on his mind. Henry's research was published in a small local journal, and for a time the story was discussed in classrooms and coffee shops. But as the years passed, the legend faded once more, replaced by new scandals, new tragedies, new mysteries. The land where the Wilson farm once stood was eventually sold, the well filled in, the foundation buried beneath a new crop of corn. But the story never truly died. It lived on in the memories of those who had heard it, in the dreams of those who felt its weight, in the whispers of the wind on moonless nights. In the 1970s, a group of paranormal investigators visited Ross County, drawn by rumors of ghosts and curses. They camped near the site of the old farm, setting up cameras and recording equipment. They claimed to capture strange lights, unexplained voices, and cold spots near the well. Their findings were published in a book about haunted places in Ohio, and once again, the legend of the Wilson brothers was revived. Tourists came, hoping to catch a glimpse of the past, to feel the chill of a debt unpaid. But for the people of Ross County, the story was more than just a curiosity. It was a part of their identity, a reminder of the power of secrets, the strength of family, and the danger of promises made in desperation. The Wilson brothers became symbols of guilt, of loyalty, of the terrible price of silence. Their story was told and retold, each version adding new details, new twists, new warnings. In the end, the truth of what happened in the summer of 1879 may never be known. The records are gone, the witnesses long dead, the land reclaimed by time. But the legend endures, a shadow on the heart of Ross County, a debt that can never be paid. And so, if you ever find yourself driving through southern Ohio on a moonlit night, and you see a patch of wild woods where the corn grows thin and the wind whispers through the trees, remember the Wilson brothers. Remember the oath they swore, the secret they kept, and the price they paid. Listen closely, and you might hear the echo of their voices, carried on the wind. Blood is blood. A debt must be paid. If this story sent a chill down your spine, don't forget to subscribe for more tales of forgotten history, dark secrets, and mysteries that refuse to die. Share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think really happened to the Wilson brothers? And would you keep a secret, no matter the cost?